So I hope everyone is okay with this. If you're not, you can obviously switch your camera off, but we do record those sessions because we publish them afterwards on the website and on YouTube. So I hope everyone is okay with that. All right. Well, it's quite handy. It's 3:33 right now. So I think we are good to go. So officially welcome everyone. I'm really excited about how this seminar series is going, and Happy New Year to all of you, because I haven't seen you this year. So I'm really pleased to welcome you all to session number 4 in our art/practice-based research seminar series. And I'm so excited about this specific session. We have a really inspiring person whom I considering my mentor and inspiration. We have Professor Carola Bohm, who is our very own professor at the Staffordshire University. And if you were in this meeting before we officially started, we were just speaking about a book Carola is writing, which I'm sure she's going to mention in this presentation today. And the title of this session today is Methodological Quagmires in a Post-Disciplinary Era. And here, I think this is a subject which is really close to everyone's challenges, really, depending on what kind of, in fact, it doesn't matter what kind of creative discipline you're working with. We all work in between many things. So it will be a really exciting session. Now, let me just give you a brief introduction about Carola. So Carola Bohm has 2 degrees from 2 different types of disciplines. So she has a degree from arts, specifically music, as well as sciences, electrical engineering and computer science. So she definitely defines herself as a genuine interdisciplinarian. And as such, she's passionate about being interdisciplinary and being creative in the international context, and also about the role that universities play in our creative sectors and communities. Carola has worked both in academia and the industry, including carrying on industry consultancies, and she sees herself as an academic leader with an in-depth view of higher education in Britain today. And introducing a little bit her book she's just about to publish, which I'm sure we're going to have a chance to talk about more. Before working at STAS, she held she held other positions at the Manchester Metropolitan University, University of Glasgow, University of Wolverhampton, and Royal Conservatory of Music in Den Haag. I hope I pronounced it well, in Netherlands. She's a regularly invited to give keynote talks at different institutions. She holds memberships on editorial boards and conference committees. She also sits on peer national and European research funding panels, and she has a track record of research and enterprise projects in multiple institutions. I'm not going to name them all right now, but definitely you will see that Carola is a very established person here, and she definitely knows what she's talking about. And as I said, a very inspirational person. Now, I think the last thing we should mention here that in terms of her funding proposals, funding projects, they all amount to a total value of 4 million over the last 15 years. So definitely someone to learn from quite a lot. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it on to you, Carola, and then we're gonna resume afterwards with questions.
Thank you so much. That was quite a, I'm blushing, introduction, comprehensive introduction. I'm just going to get my windows in the right place because I do want to see you, and I found a way how to do that. So that's so if I'm looking into various directions, that's why that is. So let me just get you on one screen, so I can kind of see. But there might be questions in the chat that I don't catch. But do feel free to do that. I should also note I'm actually situated in lovely Alsager, just across the train station. So suddenly, if war seems to break out in terms of the soundscape, it's just a train rumbling by. Somebody else thought, oh my God, what's happening? Is there an earthquake going on? And it was just a train. So that might happen. So I pitched to Agatha this notion of talking about methodological quagmires in the post-disciplinary area, and you will probably see why I pitch that when we get on to it, because as we know, practice as research has become established, specifically in the UK, not actually as much in other European countries, but we are at the forefront of that. Although it has been welcomed in academic communities, and you'll see that was my summary that you probably all got in your inbox, it does often find itself in positions needing to justify its effectiveness. And I do think that there's resistance to these new methodologies. That's actually quite a common thing when looking at the evolution of interdisciplinary research inquiry. And practice as research is often inter and even transdisciplinary in its nature. And we're going to talk about the differences of that, and thus encounters this age-old divide between basically theory and practice. And of course, that's such a key thing for practice as research or arts-based research as well. So my presentation will foreground this in the context of ever-growing knowledge domains that are in need of new methodological developments. So my structure is, I'm going to talk slightly a bit about myself, but it's not just to foreground myself, it's to put the eye into my methodology. And I will also tell you the reasons why. And then as a second section, we've just got to talk about interdisciplinarity. It is a bit of the motherhood and apple pie, and I'll go into that. And we all know kind of what this is all about, but it's one of those things that we all think we're on the same page. And then when we delve into it, there might be the nuances that influence, of course, our methodologies or methodological choices. And that's where I get to in the third part, where I talk about the quagmires. But of course, there will be upland fields, as they say in English. We get from the quagmires to the culinary arts, and hopefully you'll be with me by that point as well. So as Agatha said, I studied both arts and sciences, so music and computer science and electrical engineering. So I was trained in two very different research cultures. And my research in the first 10 years of my academic journey was music technology or music informatics, and whatever you call this discipline, and that already shows one quagmire, a sort of discipline that was not yet a discipline. And so in 2005, I wrote that I saw music technology as an interdisciplinary subject, which amongst other interdisciplinary subjects emerging in the last couple of years is still struggling to come to terms with different methodologies of its own user community. And of course, we know that disciplines like neurosciences, biochemistry, biomedical engineering, as well as computer science have been put together from, for instance, physics and mathematics. These disciplines are emerging. And in the first 10 years of my academic career, and I was researching into music technology and MPEG-7, which went into MP3s and these kind of things, I continually wondered why it was so hard to be an interdisciplinarian. So around 2001, I was already then asking the questions, why is it so hard to teach what we think should be taught or to research what we think should be researched when you are in an interdisciplinary field like music technology? And as you can see, this is one taxonomy. I was dealing with a tiny bit of psychology, but mostly music, informatics, electronics, engineering, acoustics. Those were the fields that I was dealing with. And so my question was, why is it so hard? And I realized that I started to use those famous quotes, this hand movement, something that Umberto has called the postmodern attitude, the postmodern quotes. So the typical and often cliched hand movement, putting quotes, in my case, postmodern ones, around every mentioning of the word music technology. Postmodern because I know that you know that I know that it is not as simple as that this term has perceptually different and shifting meanings pending the context it was being used in, that this complexity of its perception was an indication of the fragmentation of our formerly so holistically humanistic concept of knowledge, its production, and its education. So this is the first time I consciously encountered this terminological quagmire. And on the slide, you see actually all the terms that I encountered in my field and how they had different meanings. So even the word music technology has a different meaning in the US context than it has in the UK context. Now, for us in the UK, sonic arts has slightly different meanings than music technology or computer music. And at the heart might be the same things, but the communities are different. So this is where I started off from. And so I started to make this my own academic line of inquiry. And at that time, I started to research these questions in music technology, in higher education. How do we create a supporting and valuable learning and research environment for students and staff in an area which reaches not only over different scientific domains, but also over different working and investigatory methodologies, different approaches for presentation and practice, different underlying, but often implicit, so not mentioned, justificational hypothesis, why we put forward the methods that we do, why we suggest that there are these tools that we suggest that they are. And of course, it also has different vocabularies, different terminologies, and then come on top of that, different conceptual frameworks. And I always say that I will not mention, but then I do mention it, that it often involves different budgets and administrative units. And this feeds into the complexity of these things. So my question at the time, how do existing higher education frameworks allow interdisciplinary degrees, such as music technology, that was always my case study, to be taught and researched? And so you don't have to read that, but those were just in a time span from 2001 to 2007, some of the publications that dealt around that. And so my research evolved around this question, publishing and presenting at various conferences. And just to show you some slides, I did a qualitative analysis as well as a quantitative analysis. And this was the result of the quantitative analysis, where I just did a lot of number crunching of UCAS numbers, how many degrees were there, how many BAs, how many BScs, what kind of names were being used, all these kinds of things. And the qualitative analysis was where I visited something like 40 institutions, did something like 60 structured interviews to understand some of the more qualitative nature of this phenomena of music technology in higher education. So I did look at the degree and the disciplines, how do staff perceive them, their discipline to be situated in, also the administrative side, where were they structured, were they in computing science departments, were they in music departments, and then also the cultural barriers that they feel, these kinds of things. So it was a qualitative. And so the culmination of all this was actually a new journal, which is what we, I guess, do in academics. And the inaugural article in that journal was actually the sort of key publication that is being used nowadays was an article called the discipline that never was current developments in music technology in higher education in Britain. And that was published in 2007. And it was a sort of landscape of the phenomena of music technology in higher education in Britain. And it's really interesting because it was used, it's the sort of go-to place now for any kind of staff teams setting up new music technology degrees. It's an article that they go to. We've updated it in 2018, so 10, 11 years later. We didn't get around to it, so we didn't get the even 10-year number, but we did write actually updates to it. And why I think I want to foreground that is because my own journey is actually an important element to the methodologies that I choose today. So Addison and Fitzgerald have highlighted, and I use their quote quite often, that any methodology is always based on some philosophical views, a world view. Otherwise, it's just merely a method, like a recipe. And so I have a feeling that we too often ignore this philosophical context. Often the conceptual frameworks exist only implicitly, so they're left unmentioned. But there is, of course, a growing acceptance that this explicit making of the surrounding philosophy can only improve our understanding of how we develop research inquiries for specific contexts. And that's where we then come to this notion of interdisciplinarity, because of course that influences also which methodology one might need. And of course, interdisciplinarity has been said to be the modern motherhood and apple pie issue. Everyone talks about it. Everyone, including decision makers in higher education, recognizes that it's a good thing. But actually, until quite recently, it's rarely been interrogated in great detail. And that movement has only really started. And if you think even in our higher education systems, interdisciplinarity, actually even in the education system, interdisciplinarity seems to be easier at primary, a bit more difficult at secondary, difficult in the UK, not in some of the other countries, at higher education, and then in research, it's again a bit easier. So there are things in relation to that. But we know that the way a particular discipline, and again, I often use the case study music technology, that a particular discipline as becomes established and how it evolves has as much to do with institutional and governmental politics, social constructs, and pedagogical methodologies as it does with the discipline itself. And so I should actually note that discipline is about that image is about 10 years old, so the graphics is not quite as good. But you can see I was trying in that image to say, I was in the music department. I was teaching students from 6 departments, and I was salaried out of yet another department. And the funny little balls, the funny little somethings, the funny were the interdisciplinary bits which happen in the gaps between. Because the experience of the first 10 years in my career was actually one which left me questioning, does interdisciplinarity remain as weeds in the cracks of a monodisciplinary concreted consciousness? That was a quote that I used at the time. And until 2010, scholarly books focusing on interdisciplinarity were actually quite far and few between. And if you think about it, that's only 12 years ago. It's nothing. Sperber wrote actually still in 2008 that interdisciplinarity is the most seriously underthought critical, pedagogical, and institutional concept in the modern academy. And we still do not normally discuss among ourselves interdisciplinarity per se. What we do is work on issues that happen to fall across several disciplines, and for this we establish collaboration. And I still felt that in 2010, that it seemed we hadn't learned much. This classical divide between the arts and the sciences was still there. And, this was decades after, the classic article, and it's there as the third row, C.P. Snow's classic article on the cultural divide between the arts and the sciences, penned in 1959. And I still felt the gap every day in academia. And although the communities on both sides of the gap were talking, they certainly weren't understanding each other. And I think even now in 2022, I often feel that we still live in a world where those in the sciences criticize the lack of empirical methods of humanities scholars and their seeming reliance on subjective interpretations. And in turn, those in the humanities attack scientists for a misguided faith in the possibility of absolute objectivity, a narrow conception of useful knowledge, and an unwillingness to interrogate the broader social, political, and cultural implications of their work. And of course, if you imagine, there's always the critique of the reduced, the controlled environment of any kind of testing, and whether you can only do that in the lab and it's never actually be able to be gotten out into the real world. But actually, many of these disagreements can be traced not only to the different scope and subject matter of the sciences and humanities, but to their contrasting assumptions about how knowledge should actually be accumulated. And this, of course, relates directly to how you deal with disciplinarity. So we need to talk about interdisciplinarity. And for that, I want to just look at some images of interdisciplinarity. So is interdisciplinarity when two people with two functions have merged into one successfully, like this cartoon from 1793, from a time where doctors slowly phased out midwives? So there was a struggle there of the different disciplines. Is disciplinarity when we are aware that we have crossed a boundary, like this chemist, and he suggests he needs to stop his research as it leads him into the realm of physics? And of course, this might be far-fetched, but even just recently, I've received feedback from an unsuccessful research application where the person said, should this research council really fund this, or should actually the other research council fund this? So we still fall a bit between the gaps. Is interdisciplinarity when we are actually not so certain about where and who we are? And this is an example by the Canadian Science Scouts, and they have these badges. So if you're in astronomy, you get an astronomy badge, and it tells everyone, I'm into this discipline, and I want the badge at the bottom, the somewhat confused as to what scientific field I actually belong to badge. Interdisciplinarity when we feel we've created something new, or when we have defined, in this case, computer music, what an interdisciplinary area is made up of, or repeatedly redefined and again redefined. And the last one was actually out of my article in the 2007 journal, where I looked at where music technology is taught, and one is more in sound recording, Tonmeister, those kinds of contexts. One is more in computer science and engineering departments, and one is more in music departments. Is interdisciplinarity when music has met with science and been flung into outer space? There's, of course, a picture of Voyager 1, which had Mozart and Chuck Berry on it. Or is interdisciplinarity when it's rather been hurtled back into a cliched popular culture? Is it when we feel we've been invaded? Or when there's a technology push? And again, some people might recognize this technology. This is pure data. Is it when there's a creative pull, like the creative momentum pulling the development of new art galleries, which are located in former industrial sites? And this again is, I think it's from 2007. You know, this industry worker, factory worker, saying to his son, "One day, son, all these will be art galleries." So the concept of interdisciplinarity by 2010 had become a buzzword. And there were certain things also happening. So this is an image updated in 2013 by Columbia University, and they created this map of science. So they tracked article citations across scholarly journals, and they wanted to look at how they clustered. And if we color this into the arts and sciences, we actually still can show that at that time that divide really was still eminently there. So the arts and humanities in yellow and the sciences in blue. And you can see that there are some areas where they are getting together, but it's still quite dominantly apart. So this tension between humanities and sciences provided a challenge for interdisciplinarity. And Moran, who wrote actually a whole book just about interdisciplinarity, suggested that interdisciplinarity is often seen as a critique of academic specialization as a whole. It often draws attention to the fact that what is studied and taught within universities is always a political question. And so when we talk about interdisciplinarity, I find it actually helps to actually distinguish between different dimensions. So there's the academic. So how do we allow research inquiries to happen? And in it comes also the methodologies. How do we foster it in our own curricula and degree structures? So that's all the academic. And then there's the organizational and the political. Of course, which institutional infrastructures allow it to happen most easily? You know, what kind of faculty structures you have, but also the political, what kind of policies, you know, creative industry policy, these kinds of things. And being clear also in terms of the organizational and political, being clear of what is a money-saving device or what generally supports interdisciplinarity. And then there's the social as well. And with the social comes, of course, the acknowledgement that disciplines, above everything else, are actually social constructs. It's individuals coming together and forming common terminologies, common methods in order to feel that they are part of a collective and that is defined. And of course, this all leads to a number of quagmires. And this is where we get to my section where we look at some of the quagmires. And I've sort of counted them up. I think I've got something like 6. We'll see how many I have. The first quagmire is this issue about knowledge production assumptions. Because what is research and how knowledge is acquired stands at the heart of the choice of what kind of methodologies you might mean. And again, quoting Moran, many of these disagreements can be traced to the contrasting assumptions about how knowledge should actually be accumulated. And I have on that side, on the right side, sort of this dichotomy which exists. And yes, you can map it a bit towards art and science, but it's not quite as straightforward as that. And I just want to really short go into them. Many of them we know, so I apologize for those who are completely used to them, but I'm just going to go through them to show what this, what I find is quite a sort of quagmire. So of course there's this dichotomy between quantitative and qualitative. In short, of course, I think it's probably the most known one. Quantitative, more used in the science. Measurement is central to quantitative research, and qualitative is essentially narrative-oriented. And of course, there's much more to it, but that's a major dichotomy between different methodologies in the arts and the sciences. There's, of course, empirical versus constructivistic. So again, in the sciences, the empirical, the prediction is the crucial test of scientific validity. You have a hypothesis, you test the hypothesis, you prove it right or wrong. And constructivistic, of course, is more in the art humanities. And of course, the essential test of a science is that it should provide a coherent, consistent, and wide-ranging theoretical organization. That's the constructivistic kind of approach. It's basically constructed truth. And specifically in the arts, we quite often say, do you have a robust, rigorous conceptual framework, meaning that you have that inner logic in that system that you establish yourself. Then the dichotomy between positivism and phenomenalism. So part of it, positivism, this notion of the truth is out there and it's just waiting to be discovered. Facts exist independently of any theories or human observation. And of course, the phenomenalism on the other side is physical objects do not exist as things in themselves, but only as a perceptual phenomena or sensory stimuli. And of course, one is more in the sciences and one is more in the arts. Then there's a dichotomy between rationalism and idealism. With rationalism, a reason as a source of knowledge, reason as a source of knowledge. And again, a quote here, truth is not sensory, but intellectual and deductive. Whereas on the idealism side, it's objective idealism, sort of this notion that the external world is in some way an artifice of the mind. And the objective world is independent of man does not exist. The objective world independent of man does not exist. And then, of course, there are some which can't be quite mapped to arts and sciences. There might be a bit of a dominance, but a posteriori and a priori, and people might have heard about that or completely known to them. A posteriori, all non-trivial knowledge is ultimately derived from some kind of external experience, whereas, of course, a priori, knowledge is knowledge gained or justified by reason alone without direct influence of any particular experience. And then as a one of the last ones before the big one, a sort of dichotomy between the analytic and synthetic. And analytic, of course, analytic proposition being that it's true simply by the virtue of the meaning. So for instance, that statement, all widows have husbands that have died. Whereas, of course, synthetic proposition is rather one where the predicate concept is not contained in its subject concept. So some widows are unhappy, so it's not contained in with that. And the big one, as I mentioned, is this notion of linearity or non-linearity. And I find that's almost the biggest one that, and the easiest one, the most pragmatically clearest one, that where we can understand how different these two cultures are. With the linear type of knowledge production, of course, trying to really go through these stages. You expose a problem, you have a hypothesis, you establish a problem language, you critique alternatives, you describe a solution, you demonstrate a solution, you evaluate a solution, you elaborate consequences, and then you come to a conclusion. And of course, on the other side, and that's much more being used in the arts and humanities, you have much more nonlinear sort of processes. You might have a hypothesis, or you might have a number of questions, a line of inquiry, and you review the issue. And then you have different perspectives that bear onto that line of inquiry. And in this case, Patterson in 2006, who was actually a colleague with me at Glasgow University, he always said, this opinion creates then a weight of opinion that you come to a likely conclusion. So it is slightly different. And one can see that just looking at those things, how deeply philosophical the choice of methodology is. And it has something to do with how you as the individual really sees the reality of the world. And that's something that we shouldn't forget. So the next quagmire is rather about that there are more than one form of disciplinarity. It's not just one thing. So it helps to differentiate and have a nuanced terminology to be able to differentiate between these different forms. So intradisciplinarity, so the interdisciplinary analysis involves work within a single discipline, so we know that, such as the biologist investigating cell structure of a particular organism. Cross-disciplinary activity views one discipline from the perspective of another, such as a physics lab in which principles of physics are used to understand the acoustics of music. So we can understand that as well. Multidisciplinary analysis draws on the knowledge of several disciplines, each of which provides a different perspective on a problem or issue. In multidisciplinary analysis, each discipline makes a contribution to the overall understanding of the issue, but in a primarily additive fashion. So you have two disciplines, 1 + 1 is 2. And that's absolutely useful. And I've used that as well in some research projects, a bit of physics, a bit of music, and we have a more holistic understanding looking at it from two perspectives. But interdisciplinary, and I would call myself an interdisciplinarian, interdisciplinary analysis requires integration of knowledge from the disciplines being brought to bear on an issue. And the resulting understanding is greater than simply the sum of its disciplinary parts. So it's almost like 1 + 1 = 3. You get something in addition to just the sum of its parts. However, the focus on integration should not imply that the outcome of interdisciplinary analysis will always be a neat, tidy solution in which all contradictions between the alternative disciplines are resolved. Interdisciplinary study may indeed be messy, and it may be contradictory. However, contradictory conclusions and accompanying tensions between disciplines may not only provide a fuller understanding, but could be seen as a healthy symptom of interdisciplinarity. And so an analysis which works through these tensions and contradictions between these different disciplinary systems of knowledge with the goal of synthesis, bringing it all together, so the creation of new knowledge, that often characterizes the richest interdisciplinary work. So, and that's sort of my view on that. It can be messy, it can be contradictory, but it gives you more insights. And just to look at the last one, trans-disciplinarity. Trans-disciplinary analysis, in Stember's words, is concerned, and this is a quote, concerned with the unity of intellectual frameworks beyond the disciplinary perspectives. It may deal with philosophical questions about the nature of reality and the nature of knowledge systems that transcend disciplines. And some of you might have really transdisciplinary lines of inquiry, which really just go beyond the disciplines as such. But being aware of that, so that's also another potential for this quagmire. And going to the next quagmire is something which I've called, well, somebody else has called the brittleness of disciplines. The age of specialisms stems from a still modernist view of university, and it stems from the 18th century and the age of enlightenment. So when one had prioritized knowledge depth over knowledge breadth, and in the realm of history, it's actually still modern history as such. This modernist view aimed at developing objective science, universal morality and law, and autonomous art according to the inner logic. And this is a quote by Habermas. So if you think about it, the joint degree model, which is still quite common in many universities, stems actually from this belief that in order to achieve new insights, you need two pieces of depth, you need two disciplines of depth. And it sort of prioritizes this notion that you have to be able to study one discipline at a time to get that depth. And so for me, that was always the question, because when I went and interviewed loads of institutions, there were those degrees which had music technology where they integrate everything together. So there was math for musicians, physics for musicians, and stuff like that. And then there were those degrees which had two different departments where the joining of two disciplines, that was the task of the student. They were just studying math in one department or physics in one department and music in another. And so there are two different, again, ideologies at play there. And of course, again, financial aspects as well. But for me, the question was really, don't we need a balance between the prioritizing deep specialisms with broad interdisciplinarism? We need actually both. And actually already 24 years ago, Habermas claimed that the project of modernity, that's a monodisciplinary kind of thinking, in university education may have failed. And this is actually concept 2. The belief that a department could have experts in all areas of degree subject area stems from this notion. Also that we can study a subject in all its forms, that its boundaries are clear and defined, but our knowledge has grown beyond the ability of universities to provide educators in all fields. Or, as more recently Sperber postulates, current disciplinary systems may be becoming brittle. And when I was a student, there were still music departments around which had a 20th century specialist, 19th and 18th century, Renaissance, medieval, antique music. And that was the attempt to cover a knowledge area. But of course, this is where concept 3 comes in. The current disciplinary systems may be becoming brittle because knowledge domains are expanding to that extent that one department can't even hold that knowledge corpus altogether. And of course, I talk about it actually in another context when I talk about University 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, because actually we as academics in that former model, in that first model, yes, we were the knowledge providers. And of course, there was no such thing as the internet. But by the second University 2.0, we become curators of the knowledge because knowledge domains have expanded so much. So academics need to choose. So you have music technology degrees, computers, music informatics degrees, and they have slight nuances. And it's the curation of that knowledge which suddenly becomes a key activity of academics rather than understanding what a corpus of knowledge actually is. And so all of this points to the need of a postmodern acceptance of fragmented but self-organizing areas of knowledge in which, and this is a quote, particular foundations would emerge in the course of the inquiry rather than be predetermined in the form of discipline-bound theories, methods, or schools of thought. And of course, this has core implications for knowledge institutions like universities. And of course, one implication is also to deal with this issue between theory and practice. And that's my fourth quagmire, and I'm quoting actually Robinson here, we need to get over the divide between the academic and the non-academic and the theoretical and practical and see it as what it is, a myth. And some of you probably have seen or heard Robinson speak about that. He sort of suggests that the concept of differentiating between the vocational and the academic is based on a series of some assumptions about social structure and capacity and a very specific intellectual model of the mind. This, and this is a quote from his talk, was essentially the Enlightenment view of intelligence, that real intelligence consists of this capacity of a certain type of deductive reasoning and the knowledge of the classics originally, what we came to think of as academic ability. And this is deep in the gene pool of public education, that there are two types of people, academic and non-academic, smart people, non-smart people. And the consequence of that is that many brilliant people think they are not because they are being judged against this particular view of the mind. So this was Robinson in 2010. It's a brilliant little video that was recorded. His speech was recorded. So I do actually can recommend it. Absolutely fabulous. But that's another quagmire. This age-old theory versus, we actually got Greek writings that talk about this tension between music theorists and music practitioners. It's there. The next quagmire is, well, knowledge production isn't static. It has evolved. And again, this might be very, very known to many of you. Gibbon's classic writings about mode 1 and mode 2, this is from 1994, where he already differentiates between the different ways how we produce knowledge. So mode 1, it's predominantly linear. It's predominantly discoveries are within the discipline. Predominantly, it's interested in delivering comprehensive explanations of the world. And in this linear innovation model, the non-linear is of no major concern. And of course, in terms of how do you measure quality in these kinds of systems, you measure it through peer review. And how do you measure success? You measure it through research excellence. And those terms probably sound very, very familiar. Mode 2, according to Gibbons, is more about problem solving, social accountability, and reflexivity. It's much more about knowledge production, which becomes diffused throughout society, and tacit knowledge is valid. And of course, the quality would actually be measured by the community of practitioners adopting that, and the success would be the usefulness. And I've actually maintained, those of you who've been involved in research excellence frameworks and research assessment exercises, you probably also recognize that even in the last ref, but also in the ref before, there's a tension going on between mode 1 and mode 2. So when we have to put in research output, that predominantly could be matched to a mode 1 type of ideology, whereas the impact case studies could be predominantly matched to a mode 2 kind of ideology. So it's interesting that we're still in this sort of struggle between these different kinds of understandings how knowledge production could be produced. And I should say that has actually been extended by Karayanis in 2012, who put forward mode 3, which is a suggestion that you can simultaneously use in an adaptive way mode 1 and mode 2, depending on what kind of knowledge production or research you're actually doing. And of course, in that, he also foregrounds that partnership, co-production, and co-owning of knowledge is important, and I'll go into that in a second as well. So there's a balance of both cooperation and competition. So sometimes it's being named co-opetition, a new word. And again, the quality is impact on policy, and the success is impact on society. So the impact agendas come in there as well. So that's quagmire 5, that knowledge production is evolving. And this is possibly a bit of a continuation, but with that comes, of course, this new notion of, the role of universities, and the fact that our old models of knowledge production were increasingly be perceived to be closed off to some extent, as those sort of relate to the ivory tower kind of notion, and that external communities. And of course, it's the external communities where we in the universities would like our research to be situated in and have impact and change the future, shape the future, but that our external communities had a hard time of gaining access. And, this comic was from that time, which was so typical at the time. But, we still have externals, as you probably know from your own sort of contexts, who say, I don't even know who I can talk to within the institution. So there are still some barriers there. But the European Union at that time, of course, put forward a policy, and the policy was called Open Innovation 2.0. And it's interesting that within this open innovation policy, which they put in all their European frameworks, and I actually review European frameworks. The last framework, it was still a policy. And when I reviewed the applications, almost none applications had it inherently in. This time around, the next framework started actually last year. I was again reviewing applications, and there were few that did not have embedded that way of talking about research, that you co-create, that you innovate and have an ecosystem where you co-produce that knowledge altogether. And of course, one of the big advantages of that is actually when you co-produce new knowledge together, then the impact becomes almost immediate, and you can apply the research right from the start. So it's not a linear process. And this is, again, just from the European Union. You can see on the right side, open innovation, there are some of these key points, key terms: ecosystem, mashup, quadruple helix. That's sort of about partnership work, no boxes, interdisciplinary, and value constellations. So those were my quagmires. And coming slightly towards the end, I will not take too long, but how do we get to the sunny uplands? And this is where I sort of titled it, the culinary arts of methodological development, so to speak. And I'm not going to talk actually about practices research or arts-based research as much, because I know that this whole series is about that. And I'm just going to foreground that there are, of course, also flavors there. There are different types of nuanced methodologies which people have shifted and changed. And so, for instance, this slide is just one by Robin Nelson, who, of course, was famous to sort of contextualize that as, you have know-how, you have know-what, you have know-that, and in the center is the praxis, and there's a whole book written about that from 2009, 2010, I think. So I'm not going to actually spend so much time, but I'm going to just try to explain what I did in my culinary arts by way, and this is not just about promoting the book, but just by way of understanding that there is the possibility to not just take something from this smorgasbord of different methodologies, but you can actually intentionally design the methodology. You can intentionally choose the methods and the approaches for presentation and the justificational hypotheses, and then also the vocabularies and terminologies. And you can create a methodology for a line of inquiry that one might have. And I'm just going to talk us through how I did that with this upcoming book. And I don't know if it works, if it will be well received. So it's an interesting one, but that's what I did, and we'll see how good it works. And I should actually say this book, Art in Academia, the short blurb is, this book is about the delightful nooks and crannies of where art finds itself in academia, exploring questions of where art lives in the university sector and how it interacts with the outside, how it reaches beyond its boundaries. So it looks at this phenomena of arts in academia, and of course that's a complex one. And of course it recognizes that art not only lives in our teaching degrees, in our degrees that we teach, or in the research that we do, but universities use it to reach out to communities, universities use it to draw audiences in, universities use it to convey messages. So art is a much more complex thing than just simply research and teaching. And I wanted to look at this phenomena and to understand it more deeply. And the main ingredient for my methodology was actually the cultural political economy framework, which is actually not very well known in the arts. But it's a framework that allows you to reduce the complexity of a phenomena by having specific selectivities. So you have a structural selectivity, so you can consider what kind of policies are in place that influence the foundation of institutions. What kind of structures of institutions do you have that influence the behavior of the phenomena that you're looking at? The second selectivity is discursive. So you can use text sources. You can have a discourse analysis of key policy documents. You can have structured interviews in there. You can have imagery, sources, movies where you do a sort of discourse analysis onto. And that's the discursive selectivity. You can have agency. Are there key policymakers, key leaders, is there collective leadership? Are there community organizations which has shifted the way something is perceived or something is being done? So that's agency. And then there's the technological selectivity. Does technology change something? Social media, how has it changed art and academia? These kinds of things. So that was the existing framework. But what I actually did, I wanted to add something. And one of the things that I added was I called them lenses. And people have heard me talk about Culture 3.0 and University 3.0 before. So Culture 3.0 is basically a sort of framework, conceptual framework, not done by me. It's done by Luigi Sacco, a sort of Italian professor, looking at the evolution of how we engage in arts and culture. So that's Culture 3.0. And I'm not going to go into that, but just to say that I wanted to use that as a lens. And it's sort of comparable like an infrared glasses, that you see reality, but you suddenly switch into a different frequency. You still see the reality, but you're allowed to see nuances of that reality from a completely different perspective. And I wanted to use a Culture 3.0 lens. Similarly with university, my conceptual model of University 3.0 is about the evolution of institutional structure. And I wanted to have that lens to focus on this phenomena of arts and higher education. So those are the lenses. Then to reduce complexity further, I used what I call tableaus. And the tableaus, some people might say, well, they're case studies, but they're actually slices in time or slices in some form or manner on which I then actually apply the CPE framework, where I can look at the structural, the discursive, the agency, the technological. And these tableaus, they happen to be in various time slices to understand the interaction between creative society and creative communities and higher education. So I have these tableaus, and they allow me to have a slice in time to understand, to reduce the complexity, to understand what's happening in that time. And then sort of putting it all together, that created some of the chapters. But although it's not a historic book, it's a sort of phenomenological kind of structure. It does allow me to look at these slices, which are in particular moments in time, to understand this phenomena of arts and higher education. And this is what it looks like completely. But of course, there's a whole book behind it. But that just shows that this culinary art of creating a methodology that allows you to bring to bear upon a line of inquiry, a methodology that you have created yourself. So just before I end, this is the last slide, a quote from me, going back in time again, 2007. In order for interdisciplinary subjects to flourish without prejudice and discipline-specific cultural constraints, teaching and research have to be allowed to happen at the brink of and in the spaces between disciplines, spaces where new theories emerge out of an inquiry and where they are informed but not bound by pre-existing schools of thought. So that was me quite wordy in 2007. I honed it down in 2022 when I was preparing for this this sort of session, just simply by saying we need more methodological culinary arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carola. That was such a rich and inspiring presentation. I think as I was listening to all the points you covered over there, I thought we could actually do an entire series based on your one talk. There's so many things to unpack over there. So I think without further delay, I think we should just dive in with the questions. I'm gonna use my privileged position as someone who's leading this session to ask you the first question, and then we're gonna take the questions from chat, which I can see they're already appearing over there. So in one of the texts you kindly shared with us in preparation for this session, you said, and I don't know if this is your quote or you took it from someone else, it's pretty simple, at the same time really very revealing. You say that the world is not disciplinary, therefore obviously all the things you talk about later. Now, of course, it's just so wonderful to see contribution such as your book and what you're talking about brought into the discussion into higher education and art in higher education. Nevertheless, as we all know, in so many cases, we still really have to wear different hats, because when we apply for funding, when we apply for jobs, when we publish our work, or even when we just respond to expectations from our peers, we're still binded by these disciplinary expectations. What would be your immediate advice for people who really, really like and feel interdisciplinary? How should we navigate this very complicated world with the needs which are still very difficult to kind of ignore?
Yeah, and I would love to hear from the room, what people's experience are, because, this notion of falling between the chairs is still a common notion. But what, of course, also happens, not only might you fall between the chairs, there might be two chairs that you can sit on. So, in my experience, I found, as much as I'm falling between the chairs, as much are there opportunities that I could apply both for EPSIRC as well as HRC, theoretically. There's another matter of being successful, but there are different chairs that that one can attend to, so one can see that also as something positive. So that's one thing to mention. The other thing to mention, just in terms of research, and and I've done, so many mistakes in relation to applications or publications. Sometimes one is in a specific community, and you think that we all have the same methodology, and I've done it, several times where I didn't justify with my methodology section or chapter, to say what kind of methodology I'm actually using. So the big thing is to never ever forget to justify the methodology with which you gain those insights. So that's a big one. But I think interdisciplinarity in higher education is still quite, I would say it's still quite complicated and probably also quite difficult, because if we think about it, we still have these perceptions that our undergraduate degrees need to have that depth.
Yeah.
And that, of course, then informs the structure of departments, and it informs money flow, and it informs policies, institutional policies. And of course, we know it also informs national policies, this notion of math, STEM subjects, without the arts in schools. All of this is interrelated.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, and as you rightly said, this is such a hot keyword we use in pretty much everything. Whenever you read any funding application calls or anything to do with that, they always want interdisciplinary. But at the same time, as you rightly said, I'm not sure if everyone is on the same page when understanding what that actually means. And I just really couldn't be happier about your contribution here, and I really hope that your book will bring a little bit more light into this discussion. And I think our role as both researchers but also people who shape future generation researchers and thinkers is kind of difficult, because we need to know how to navigate this difficult conversation here. So I have plenty of questions, but what I would like to do is to open it for the public first. So if anyone has a question, if you'd like to either unmute yourself or type it in a chat, or just raise your hand and unmute yourself. We're gonna take your questions first, and then we can continue this discussion. So I think there is an article from Martin. I'm not sure if there is a question over there, but we can definitely check the article in a second. So I'm not sure if Martin has any question in relation to that. Do you, Martin?
No, I don't.
All right, no worries. Thank you so much for your contribution. And Florence has a comment about how great and inspiring and insightful your presentation was, and I couldn't agree more. Does anyone have any question they would like to ask Carola? Oh,
Vicky?
Always the first. That was really thought-provoking, Carola. It's about the how you wrestle with specialism and expertise within this context. So my research is raising the value of worker expertise within ceramics and the skilled worker. And when I've been looking at value frameworks, it's straddling between different areas. I mean, my first degree was in sociology, and I think sociology by nature is interdisciplinary and always was. But now I'm in a crafts area, so I'm actually thinking less linear and more open in relation to things. But when you're trying to look at how you value something, it kind of crosses through heritage, it crosses through crafts, it might cross into technical embodied skills. And that's not in order to present what I'm doing in an interdisciplinary way. It's taking an interdisciplinary approach in order to do my research. But my end point is actually to say there's no need to present that skill as interdisciplinary. It stands by itself as a skill. And I do think there are some specialisms within society that cannot kind of be developed without apprenticing, without working on that, and are just focusing on that one thing, which isn't particularly postmodern, but I still think there's a role within society for people that need to develop a skill in order to hit the high level of that. But the actual assessment of that makes that complicated. Can you see what I mean? So when you're looking at research, you know, if you look at UKRI, they put a lot now on interdisciplinary. But my focus would be on embodied expertise.
Yeah.
Not using an interdisciplinary framework, but just using that to research. And I just think the complexity of defining something that's purely skilled is quite difficult, other than doing the research around it. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's quite abstract, but
I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating, because I think that, of course, you know, and you're probably in the process of deciding, you know, what kind of methodology you can justify that is rigorous enough for you to persuade whoever you need to persuade that the knowledge is gained by that rigor. And I think it is, you know, that's of course at the heart of practice as research, where you could actually say, you know, the practice that you're looking at is actually pulling the line of inquiry. Of course, there's a question then, does the line of inquiry feed back into the practice? You know, that might be a question that, you know, might not be as straightforward. You know, I don't know in your context, if your sort of theoretical critical framework that you establish has the aim to feed back into the practice.
Yeah, and I suppose what I'm trying to say is, I think research, well, might be just interdisciplinary by default, maybe in some areas. I do find this is what I did from a social sciences. You just, it's not explicit. It just happens because you're trying to find something your way. Do you know what I mean? You just happen to do that. It's not explicit necessarily in teaching, but I think in research sometimes you're already taking that approach. It's just an observation, really, I suppose.
And you know, and maybe because you saw that the definition of trans-disciplinarity there was actually quite reductive in some way. It's very, very conservative. And I've come across another person's PhD about voodoo, where you realize it's on the one hand about the craft of making the dolls, it's about the history of it, it's about the you know, the mysticism, you know, there's the social aspects, there's the community aspects. And I did wonder if I would class that as transdisciplinary. So maybe we need to be more courageous, because we have become more interdisciplinary as a community, as a society. We've interrogated the terms more. Maybe we should be more courageous in classifying some lines of inquiry as transdisciplinary. And I don't know if that would fit, and one would have to argue that and what that means for the methodology, but maybe there's scope for that. You know, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Very nice questions. I have a comment on that, but before that, I think we have a question from Agnieszka first, and then Jess.
No. Hi, hello. Very nice to meet you all. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and really, very interesting formulating and defining some things. And in some ways, I think that whole field is complicated also in terms of sciences and humanities and arts and what it is that we are doing this research in. And in some ways, Agata, you may know, because we've recently been talking about it, I feel that, and actually it corresponds to what Vicky says, the notion of the embodied experience in some way, it doesn't necessarily have to involve one's body, but it does have to involve subjective experience and ethnographic, if you like, and framing it as the first kind of methodological framework. Whatever you do, I think is very important, and I wonder if you agree with that. Secondly, in terms of I'm going to post here in a minute the link to my edited collection on creative practice research in the age of neoliberal hopelessness, which basically encourages, with Edinburgh University Press, so it's a proper rigorous publisher, which is what Carola says. This is where we are, this kind of navigation. Almost the more outrageous you are, the more you have to be careful with your methodologies and stating it clearly what it is that you're doing and why, and then be prepared to defend it. And I don't know if my PhD student, who actually just passed her Viva today with minor corrections, very minor, is here, but she's not. But what I see, but what happened today is she was almost attacked on methodology. And you know how, you know, it's kind of a person who's about to be a doctor will stand firm, but obviously it's quite takes your breath away when somebody goes at you. So I think that's the thing, that in terms of, Agata, what you're saying as educators, this is our kind of key task, to encourage people to be bold, radical, revolutionary, even if it will appear, I mean, she did well, my student eventually, just as a very good ending to this, but it was quite scary, you know, when people just go ksh, 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 and if you're not trained in this whole saying, no, wait, let's hold on and let's see how that my experience actually produces knowledge. I think the first thing you said, Carola, which I thought was, for me, so inspirational, because I know it, and yet to say it clearly, it's so important. What kind of knowledge are we producing here?
Yes.
It's a philosophical statement. What is it? What are we aiming at? What is our ambition? To what extent the notion of it being fluid, which actually is, of course, non-patriarchal gesture, it's against the rigidity of patriarchy, is in itself seeking knowledge. And I think, you know, I just thought it was really great what you did, because in some ways you were subverting various things, but using the language that these guys would understand. So it's perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes. And I think I agree. You know, I think one of the times where I fell into this trap was actually, I did a sort of, you know, it was just a paper at a conference. I don't think it was a chapter or something like that, but it was about methodology for devising music information systems. And somebody said, well, you're talking about methodology, but you didn't give us the methodology with which you researched into, you know, and it becomes suddenly a meta level, which also is postmodern. So I love it actually, but yeah, but it's valid. It is valid. But I mean, just in terms of the embodied side, and I think one thing, it's slightly related, but it's slightly something completely different that I haven't even brought into this. I've been involved recently about asking the question of, so I was fortunate enough to be in a community that looked at colonialization and whiteness in the academy. And the fact that our knowledge production systems are actually based still on a culture which was created in a colonial time. And that's different kinds of communities, whether that's Aborigine communities or whether that's other cultures, have in some ways often different methodologies. They also have different ways of dealing with emotion, dealing with embodiment, dealing with creative practice. And although this wasn't part in any way in this presentation, I'm beginning to start to think that I'm missing something. I also, in my understanding of methodology, need to be decolonialized in understanding how much my approach is governed by the institutions which were created by a particular mindset, by a particular institution. These institutions are not neutral. Our universities are not neutral. And of course, you know, there's this danger that it opens up, gosh, you know, everything suddenly dissolves into gray, malleable things, and you can't hold on to anything anymore. But I think it's actually quite valid to question, you know, how much are we influenced by a sort of whiteness of our thinking? It doesn't need to be that we're white or not. It's rather we've been afforded to think in those terms and not afforded to think in other terms.
Fantastic comments, and I think this is what Agnieszka started talking about, what you kind of continue on right now, Carola, this idea of working within both research and creative arts by definition requires you to break the rules, I would argue, or at least reconsider them if you want to follow them. And I think it's really important. And I think if we just bring it back to this question of how we, again, use our expertise and challenges when we train our PhD students and undergraduate students, it's really, really important to cultivate this kind of open mind approach And when designing your own methodologies, well, I would like to have another hour to discuss that in relation to practice-based research, how this creative approach really is encapsulated in defining your methodologies. But because I think what the points we started talking about right now are very, very interesting. But I think it's really, really important not to lose the bigger picture and just always bring back to this question, what is that I'm doing? And I think, again, this idea of working in between disciplines in whichever form you've discussed before, Carola, I think it's so interesting when we talk about practice-based research, because as we, I think, Vicky, you've mentioned that before, like in relation to social sciences, but of course, with creative arts, it's the same. You never just work, if I work within film, I don't just make film, I make film about something else. Therefore, I, by definition, have to have some expertise to some degree about whatever it is that I'm making my film. And I'm really simplifying this hugely, but of course it goes much a longer way than that. And especially for many people who just working with creative media or creative arts don't necessarily sit within one single discipline, because you have to really branch yourself to other things. And I think not all the disciplines are lucky enough, like in the example you shared with us, Carola, in terms of music technology, where you ended up having your own discipline, which is kind of a merge of two, because for many people, you will be still working across 2 different or 3 or 4 different things without getting to the point where you can call it a discipline, which is really a fascinating conversation in itself. And perhaps it's not a bad thing. Perhaps it is quite interesting. And I think the way for me, as a person who always finds it very difficult, if someone asks me what is that I do, I don't, depends on the situation, I will give people different answers, because it's not really a simple one. I'm sure many people in the room can relate to that. But I think it's really interesting to also think how you navigate it. And with some of the examples you were talking about, is it that students work in between different departments and they kind of bring these two things together by themselves, or do we provide it for them, or does the institution provide it for them? This is just so fascinating. And I don't necessarily think there is a right or wrong answer of that, because again, depending on a project, a specific project, not even a discipline, it could be many benefits in the kind of combination of all these approaches. So I don't know if you'd like to comment anything on that, but I think it's just really, really.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what is what is right or wrong, there's probably no right and wrong, but I know what students like more. There's empirical evidence that they like the courses better, where everything is embedded. Where everything is. Certainly in music technology, and we could see that in those studies that we did, those degrees which even managed to do math for music technologists rather than them having to go into a math department and learn math, that just is, I guess it comes back to community again, this notion of community, and you create your own terminologies and you feel you understand each other. But that sense of community, of course, is also the boundaries against which disciplinarity then bounces against, which is something positive, because you don't have interdisciplinarity if you don't have disciplinarity. You need disciplinarity in order to have the interdisciplinarity. And just like you said, I came, when I was looking at that, I came to the conclusion, because one of the questions was also, when there is a sort of 2 disciplines that come together, is it always the case that in the evolution of these disciplines that it emerges as one discipline, or can it remain interdisciplinary forever? And my hope was that it can remain interdisciplinary forever, but we'll see, because computer science doesn't see itself as an interdisciplinary subject anymore. It's, we see it as a discipline. So, maybe I'm just looking at it in too short time spans, but, I do like that notion of the fluidity and the bouncing against boundaries that allow you to think anew and bring something in and transfer something from one area to the other. Similar, that CPE framework comes from a completely different thing. I think it allows us actually to see something in the arts and humanities, because it's a methodology not being used very much in that area. So it allows us to have completely new insights in relation to the things that we actually or might be researching.
And another thing you've mentioned, which I found really interesting, again, is this idea of how the disciplines we've mentioned are changing and how they are influenced by modern technologies. And when I think about when I studied film direction back, almost 20 years ago, was it really? it was a completely different thing to what I'm teaching my students at the moment. Because I really grew up in the world of analog film, and everything I did was very different. And yet, it's the same discipline, but it really looks so very different. So that's a very interesting thing to consider as well. And I think if you think about how fluid those boundaries are, of course, they will influence how they interrelate and link to other disciplines, which might come closer or further away, depends on how things are changing. And again, speaking about creative arts and this kind of what, it's not only about technologies, but also about the expectations and why we do what we do and who are our audiences. And again, this really fascinating question we'll be discussing in next session, which is about dissemination. How do you actually disseminate this kind of work? But because we try to think about bigger picture and how what we do, how the research we do sit within the context of higher education. And we've mentioned REF today, which again is like, how do we evaluate it? How do we really work with this idea of being interdisciplinary in relation to the way we're being evaluated? It's just really, it's really fascinating. So we only have about 10 minutes left, and I know there's some interesting comments in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read some of them and let's see if we can respond something. So Sabine says, in reference to Vicky's question, mentioning craft, where do we place crafts and skills at the level of the embodied technology of, for example, bakery, carpentry? Would there be a way of categorizing such skills and still see them from an interdisciplinary framework? Would you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I, I'll try to answer the question, but I'll probably use reference to my framework of knowledge. But I actually, as one of the things that I asked in these structured interviews, is actually, is your degree vocational or is it practice-based? And I thought, it was quite interesting because I wanted to ask at the perception of this knowledge, whether that's perceived to be a vocational or a practice-based one. And it was very interesting because all the members of staff from research intensive and old universities said, oh, it's practice-based, oh, definitely practice-based. All the new universities staff said, oh, it's vocational, it's professional and vocational. And when I then asked, okay, so what is the difference? Can you just define me what one and the other is? There was much more, yes, people came up with a sort of sentences that would in some way try to define it, but it was much more difficult to find the difference. And so what is a vocational oriented discipline, what is a practice-based or an academic discipline is really a matter of cultural context or historic context. And again, when we think about music, for instance, music is a craft, and it has been in universities for such a long time. And I was actually head of a department for 10 years of a department which had dance, for instance, drama and music. And if we compared music as an accepted academic discipline, but dance was not accepted as an academic discipline, then the only difference is the history that one had and the other one didn't have. And so when it comes back to this question of craft, I would actually, and skill, that it's sort of related to that, where I wouldn't actually engage in this notion of, I mean, you didn't ask that, Sabine, in relation to the academic or non-academic, but I think we can see that. We can just simply say, that's moot. It's a myth to differentiate between what is academic and not. And actually, there is such a thing as embodied knowledge, and there is such a thing as different ways of producing the knowledge. And of course, there's more to be said to that. So for instance, of course, in music, there are such things as composition PhDs. York University has a minimum commentary, and the main thing is the music. Whereas in other universities, you have to write a 7,000, 10,000, 20,000, whatever word commentary in relation to that. So there are these nuances of what we believe there is. But because there is this wide range, there's also the opportunity for us to justify, I think, that what we think should be able to be justified. And then it's just about the persuasive power that we can create that coherent argument in relation to. But, the way I talk, you will also see that I fall on the side of constructivistic socially constructivistic. I fall on the side of postmodern rather than the empirical side. And I'm very much aware of that. I don't know if that answered the question, but...
Brilliant. Very, very interesting. And perhaps the last thing I think we have time to discuss very briefly is this idea of University 3.0 and the kind of impact on society and economy and all the collaborations and collective work. Do you think that this approach, if really embraced on a more wide scale by academia, has a chance to ease out and maybe make this transition into interdisciplinary a little bit easier? And do you think it's attainable?
Yeah, I mean, I can actually put a blog post here in the chat, because this is like my suggestion of University 3.0. So in a nutshell, University 1 is when we held the knowledge, when we could hold the knowledge, and the learning was a transfer from the lecturers, you know, the classic notion of a big lecture hall to the students. So that kind of concept. 2.0, you could say it's a sort of marketized university. We package these products up, and the products are these knowledge curricula. So it's based on the fact that you can create a sort of package of knowledge, and you curate, academics curate, you know, and that was also fine. But I actually move on to the University 3.0, where we actually say, look, we live in a knowledge society, in a knowledge economy. Knowledge is all around us. You know, back 20 years, I was talking about acoustics, and nobody else knew what dithering in acoustics was. I needed to tell them, you know, the details and how to measure and, you know, what to do with dithering, because it's a sort of audio kind of thing. You know, now I would be laughed out of the classroom. They just take 1 second to Google it and know what dithering is. So the way teaching has completely changed because knowledge is all around us. Now, what it means for universities is that the role is different. We curate the environments in which learning happens. We shouldn't own the knowledge anymore. And all of our quality assurance mechanisms are still based on this notion that we could define the knowledge, but the knowledge is all around us. So we are rather there where we need to think about how do we create this environment in which learning happens. And we still need these knowledgeable actors like, you know, professors, and because we need to facilitate that learning process. But it's a different way of engaging with knowledge. And with that comes, if you focus on the environment rather than the knowledge content, it does away with the disciplines to a certain extent, or the boundaries of the disciplines. So I think there's hope. And I see that loads of universities, and I think that might be one of the readings that are also that was distributed, suggests that you can see an increase of pedagogical methods. So not quality assurance mechanisms, but pedagogical methods. So it's the academics who've already, you know, realized that, you know, we need to teach and we need to learn differently. That could be aligned to what I have classed University 3.0. But they are put in place despite some of the quality assurance mechanisms that try to push us back into a 2.0 kind of university world, because it's much easier to package up, it's much easier to sell, it's much easier in a sort of neoliberalized kind of perception of what a university is. That's a whole nother issue.
It is, and again, it's really fascinating. Funny enough, I was working, one of the things I did this morning was work on the reflective piece of my HE portfolio, and I was just reflecting on exactly what you're talking about, how we facilitate learning rather than just teach in a traditional meaning of that world. And I was reflecting quite in depth on how the techniques for teaching and learning has evolved over the past whatever many years, and how it really relates to what you're just talking about, and how, again, I didn't think about it at that time, but how very interdisciplinary it is by definition, because of the fact that we live in this kind of knowledge saturated or information saturated world. So of course we need to know how to navigate it in an effective way, so that we can really focus the attention of our students to the value of doing certain things in a specific way, rather than just a specific piece of knowledge which they can possibly find somewhere else. So it is a very, very exciting time, I think. However challenging, I think it's just really, really fascinating. So it's 4 minutes to 5. I'm just gonna ask if there's any final question from the audience. And then I'm just going to do a 2 minutes wrap up just to.
Oh, I love cognitive imperialism. I just see the chat. Yes, I will look that up.
Yeah, I'm sorry I haven't read every single message over there, but of course, for everyone who is in this meeting, you will have access to the recording. And of course, I'm just going to be, I will be uploading the recording from the meeting as well. So hopefully we can all just use all the things and resources which we have in a chat. So if there is no further questions, I'm just very quick. Oh, Jess, I'm so sorry. You had your hand up. I'm so sorry. It was just all yours. I'm so sorry.
Thanks, Carolyn. This goes back to something you were saying earlier, but just to come back into what you were just speaking about. When I was at teacher training college in the 1970s, and it was a very left-wing socialist college with a lot of exciting stuff going on, I remember one of the first things that ever happened in one of the first lectures was that we were told that you have to understand that the teacher knows nothing until the school has spoken. And it feels like we're coming back to that now. Yeah. And because of that, I continued with teaching, but when it suddenly stopped, I stopped. But just very quick, I was very amused by the idea, the word that you used as a quagmire, in relation to my research, which is a bit of a quagmire, because as you know, I'm doing part of my work is on walking, which everybody knows what it is, but nobody knows what it is as an art. And I sort of feel that. Do you feel that this geographical thing of between a hard and a soft place, where it's mixed up, the water and the earth and the plant material, through your research and what you're saying is, do we have to cross it with a bridge, or do we have to just put our welly boots on, or do we just have to swim across it, or how does? And I know that goes back to the earlier conversation, but perhaps it's a bigger discussion for another time.
Wow, but what a lovely thought. Gosh, what a lovely thought. I need to think about it. We probably need everything. But in relation to the term that I use, and it shows again my background. My background, of course, is also music. So there was a famous essay that somebody said, in the quagmire of modernity. And this was when, the avant-gardist created, there were two sides to it, complete control type of music like Stockhausen, to complete freedom like Cage, and then all the, avant-garde artists that came around. So it probably shows more my background than this beautiful, detailed kind of thinking that you've just raised in relation to mapping it with walking in the natural world. I really have to think about it. Beautiful. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Really nice question. Thank you so much. That's really good. So with the last minute here, I'm just very quickly share my screen once again, and just remind everyone who is here that what we do alongside this seminar series is also a publication at the International Journal of Creative Media Research, where I'm currently editing a special issue which is replicating almost the questions published or discussed in this seminar series. So although the deadline has just closed, if there's anyone in this room who would still like to submit a proposal with just a title and an abstract, I'll be happy to extend the deadline until the end of this week, just for you. And also, if you have an idea for a special issue you'd like to propose for the journal, just send me an email. I'll be very happy to hear from you. Also, if you'd like to get involved in talking about your research in a second round of the seminar, which will start next year, because this round is obviously all booked. This is to do with the special issue I just mentioned. And again, also, as you might, some of you know, I'm trying to gather some data in terms of what kind of people are part of this seminar. So if you'd like to help do a very quick questionnaire, which just consists of 3 questions, get in touch. The questions are about what kind of practice you're involved in, what's your artifact, and what's your research question. And another one in relation to the training and guidance, because what I'm planning to do is to develop some comprehensive training and guideline for future practice-based researchers following this seminar. And the final thing is that our next session will happen as usually on the last Wednesday of the month, which will be 23rd of February. We're very lucky to have Dr. Charlie Tweed from Bath Spa University, and Charlie, who is actually the editor at the journal we just mentioned, will be talking about dissemination. So the title of the next presentation is "Who is it for and how can we communicate it?" So we'll be continuing from the questions we touched upon with Carola today. So thank you so much, everyone. Really lovely to see people just coming back to this seminar. I hope you enjoy it. As always, I will upload the recording on the website and on YouTube. I'll share it with everyone. And thank you so much, Carola, for your incredible presentation and insights. I'm sure I'm gonna have lots of questions to you in with the next occasion we have a chat. But thank you so much. Really, really fascinating and insightful. Thank you so much.
And thank you for brilliant questions.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good afternoon. Bye.